It's a beautiful day. It's a wonderful day to be alive. All of us made it. That's one of the first things to get up and be absolutely thankful for, right? We made it. We're up, we're walking, we're breathing. Most of us, as we say down south, woke up in our right mind, right? I feel like I did. Hope I did. So just starting with an attitude of gratitude. As Laura said, I was asked, maybe asked is a better word than deputized, by Maitre to step in right now. And Maitre is the executive director, our fearless leader at Bartram's Garden, where I work, and which is the site that you see behind you on this picture of my co-director, Ty Holmberg, and myself standing in the field where we work. I won't spend a whole lot of time, since there isn't a whole lot of time, talking about myself, but I do think it's important to provide some context and to sort of lightly till the soil, skim the soil, in order to plant in some ideas here. As Laura said, I'm a fourth, maybe fifth generation, but I'm pretty sure it's fourth generation free farmer. I'm going to put that piece in, farmer. So as people of African descent in this country, the experience that most marks our arrival and to some extent our identity in this country is the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. So wherever I go, I must acknowledge that. We must lift that up because it's valuable in terms of what we've received to be able to talk about these things, and I'm very grateful for all that my ancestors endured in order to stand before you today and talk a little bit about compassion. So I'm about a fourth generation free farmer from the Mississippi Delta, where I was born and grew up. My father is a farmer from farming people. All of them were farmers before. And guess what? Most of your ancestors were farmers, right? So that's something that we all have in common. Human beings in general, this is what we've done for the past 10,000 years, wherever we were on the planet. And so I'm very proud and grateful to be able to continue that work. We do it at the Sankofa farm at Bartram's Garden, which is where I work and where Loris works, and where we're privileged to work in this beautiful field that you see in front of us. Here are some young people that we also are blessed to work with. And so this idea of compassion, thinking about it, for me feels probably most powerful when I consider these young people, right? We like to say a lot of times that the young folks are the future. Well, I really like to think of them as the present because they are alive right now. They actually are making decisions and they are being involved. The young people can change the world. In fact, in most societies, young people have been the ones who have changed the world, who have done a revolution, right? And I like the word revolution because someone reminded me that revolution implies return, right? It's not destroying, it's revolution, right? So it's to return into something deeper. And so these young people really inspire us to do that. We work with about 26 young people during the summer, all from our neighborhood where we live and work. These young people are almost exclusively from the African diaspora, like myself, which provides a unique and powerful opportunity to be able to teach them about culture, their culture, to lift up the diaspora experience, the experience of people scattered, which is not unique to us as people of African descent, but many people belong to diasporas. Many of you here are of people who have been scattered, right? And there's strength in that. There's strength in surviving that and in taking the gifts that we have for that. So these young folks give me hope and inspire and teach me compassion all the time. So it's a picture of our market where we sell the food that we grow. We are an organic farm, absolutely committed to taking care of the earth and to walking with compassion on the earth. So I've talked about some of the stuff that we do, but I think it's really important to think about what we mean when we say compassion. I recently attended the World Meeting of Popular Movements, which is a gathering of people involved in farming, labor organizing, and what was it, Terra Domus, in housing, that happened in Modesto, California. One of the rich things that I got from that experience, I don't like to travel for conferences that far. I think it often defeats the purpose, especially when we call ourselves people who are acting from our environmental justice standpoints to travel thousands of miles for a brief meeting. But really glad I did there, because there I got to hear a wonderful thing that helped to shape compassion for me. And I talk about that a little bit, as well as flesh it out with some personal experience from my life. Compassion comes from the Latin root compassio. Everyone say passio, right? It means literally, right, to suffer with, right? Passion means to suffer. The only way I think that we retain it in modern English is reference to the passion of the Christ, right? Otherwise, we think of passion as something quite the opposite of suffering. But indeed, the root is to suffer together, right? To struggle together. One of the definitions, one of the dictionary definitions of compassion is a feeling of deep sympathy or sorrow for another, stricken with misfortune, accompanied with a strong desire to alleviate that suffering, right? So that's important. So there are two pieces to this, right? Is that one willingly engages in struggle with another, or in suffering with another, or at least, at the very least, in feeling with the other. And then one is motivated to do something about that suffering, so we don't just all sit and suffer together, right? So there's two pieces to that. In philosophy and other fields, we refer to that as praxis, right? As action built in thought, from a reflection. It comes from a reflection. And so just sort of holding that idea, that what it means to be compassionate is to be bold and be brave, and to actually step into and shoulder the burden with another. We never can actually feel what another person feels, right? But there's this powerful, magical thing that happens when we engage in this spiritual activity of trying to share another's suffering. So it means that we have to actually see the person in front of us. Not what we want to see, not what has been built up for us by ideology, by the experience of others, by history that we've read, that we were taught or that we caught, right? But actually seeing the person in front of us, right? The other. So that's the first part, the bold part, right? And then you can enter into that person's struggle from that point. I'm talking about compassion set in the backdrop of our culture's current trend towards avoidance of suffering. I don't know how current it is, actually. I guess probably it's probably historical and ancient, right? But we found some ingenious ways for a select few of us to avoid suffering, right? Now, the thing we all know in the back of our mind and deep down in our heart is that my avoidance of pain and struggle comes at some kind of cost to somebody, right? And I think that one of the chief operating tools, in our current economic system and social system, is to sort of push that farther and farther in the back of our mind, right? So that we aren't bothered or troubled, so that we can get on with our day and continue the work of living. But what I'm actually offering us to consider is to actually see the person, warts and all, right? Flaws and all. And in seeing another person and actually seeing the other, we actually get to see ourselves. For me, that's happened in some powerful ways. I feel like Spirit has been preparing me for this opportunity to share all week in ways that I didn't know about, right? I didn't know that I would be called to talk to a group about this. But two sort of occasions this week stood out in my mind as soon as Maitre asked me to do this. I ask you all to hold me in compassion right now as I talk about this, because I'm sharing with a group of people I don't know from Adam or Eve, something that's very personal and that felt very impactful at the moment. So I thank you for holding that for me. There was a young woman who visited our farm. We're an African, culturally based, spiritually rooted farm, working on the land of Bartram's Garden. If you haven't visited, I encourage you to do so. You have not entered into the Philadelphia experience until you've done so. So please come and step on that land and learn something about it, because you'll find within it a microcosm of much of the richest and deepest experience of this one of the oldest cities in the country, right there on that land. So quick plug, everybody was doing their commercials. I'm gonna do my commercial for Bartram's Garden. So on our land, on the land where we're privileged to work with our community, with our elders and young people, there was a young lady who showed up, and I think that she had contacted us through our office, but messages don't always read. We working on a farm, and I am not going to, I didn't even know how to set this picture situation up. I'm glad Lars did it, because I'm happily not in tune, I think, technologically, right? I don't have to. I'm working on ancient technologies, right? And I'm just fine. So I don't always get the messages, and I didn't get the message that this young lady wanted to visit us with a great desire and a deep desire to help, really, really deep desire to help. And she'd arrived before I got to the farm and started working, apparently. And my assistants who were there didn't quite know what to do, and because they didn't know who she'd spoken to. So long story short, the lady is working in the garden when I arrived there. Our space, we've worked for many years to create lots of systems to ensure that our work is impactful, powerful, directed, and fruitful. And one of those is that we have a process for how volunteers come on so that they enter with a particular consciousness when they step on our field. So again, like I said, we're a spiritually rooted space, and so we like to know folks before we let them in the house, you know? So I didn't know this young lady, so I said, well, maybe it's just a volunteer. And when I found that she'd been there, and she basically gave us help whether we liked it or not, you know. I'm being very polite, I think, about it, because in the moment it didn't feel, you know, it didn't feel good, it didn't feel great. You know, I love the help, we want the help, but I don't know you. Can we at least talk first? And so, you know, I sent up a little prayer that I would be compassionate in talking to this young lady, and I went out to the field. I found that she apparently had made contact with one of our assistants at one of our markets, and was very, very assertive about wanting to help, and was told, you know, this is awesome, that's awesome. This is what we do, and this is how you do it on the second and fourth Saturdays. And so I guess she had some free time and decided to come outside of those times. And for me, you know, there was a lot that I was holding, you know, I think when I went to her, because part of the story of the space, part of the story of our farm is that we've carved out this space to very intentionally lift up the experience of African Americans, particularly our history and our culture, our reconnection to land. So it's actually, amongst the many things that it is, it's a hospital for deep spiritual trauma. We're all carrying deep spiritual trauma. We're all carrying trauma, some of it that's not ours, right? And for those folks who need science, you know, to understand that, look it up. It's true. Yeah, epigenetics, it's real, right? So we're carrying some stuff that we don't even know about, you know. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm trying to hold that in this young lady's experience at the same time. And we talk, and I tell her what had hurt, and she shares with me that, you know, after apologizing, she didn't know. She didn't know what she looked like. She didn't know what it felt like. She knew that she had this deep need to hurt, and I found the deep need rather to help. And I found, after talking to her and boldly trying to hold her experience in mind, that she had endured some pain and some struggle, that she, in her previous experience, knew that only the land could heal. She was new to the city and had no land, didn't know where to find it, and knew that there was a public space where there was a garden, and she'd heard wonderful things about, right? And so it was that deep need to speak to some hurts that she didn't reveal to me, but that I knew from the conversation, you know. She didn't reveal in detail, but the conversation was a part of what had drawn her there. So I had the opportunity at that moment to say, what would I do, you know? And so I chose to tell her what hurt, and then to hold her in compassion for just a moment. And that was fraught, that compassion, right? Because there was a part of me that was still upset. There was a part of me that felt almost invaded. There was a part of me that felt you know. But then there was also this part of me that knew what it was like to be holding on to some deep hurts. And there was a part of me that was grateful that this young lady knew where to find her healing, you know. She just didn't go about it the best way. You know, she knew where to find her healing. And so that was an experience that for me taught me, you know, and the conversation ended well. You know, she apologized when she realized what the space that had been taken up and how, and I got to hold her in compassion, and I got to have that sort of help to affect and shape who I am in just a small but a powerful way. You know, so that was an experience that for me, I recognize a couple of things about compassion. I recognize a couple of things that at that moment I chose to enter into her suffering for a moment. It was sloppy. It wasn't perfect because there was part of me that was holding on to a whole lot of stuff, you know. And then some of it, you know, I think it makes sense to hold on to in terms of recognizing how to take care of it, because I must be compassionate to myself as well, right? I have to hold my own self in compassion, but I chose to be brave and step out of that for a moment, and I realized that compassion doesn't have to be perfect. My compassion doesn't have to be perfect. My compassion has to be intentional. Somebody say intentional. It has to be intentional. It has to be genuine, right? And then I just have to trust that between the two of us, that the rest will be made up. I have to trust that, you know, that there's something between the two of us. If I bring that genuine intention, that will, and it may not necessarily happen the way I expect it to, right? But that's where that piece of trust. So compassion does require a bit of faith. It requires a bit of faith that I don't know what is going to happen from my effort. I do know what my intention is, right? The type of I started by talking about culture's current trend and maybe ongoing trend of avoidance of suffering and finding ingenious ways and layers of ways to sort of forestall and cover up our, you know, the suffering of the world, the suffering of people quite near us, oftentimes in our own families, often even parts of ourselves. And when we're not careful, and we know the end result of this, this creates a society that it actually feeds rather apathy and egocentricity, which we know ultimately, you know, what happens, you know, in that sort of situation. And so the idea of actually holding other people in compassion is an antidote to that. I think that we will look back on these days, this 2017 and going forward, perhaps as dark days, perhaps as grim days. It's important to know where we are right now in history, right? At least as a time of struggle and conflict, but I'm convinced that the dehumanization that we are seeing all around us, and that to a real extent our sort of building up ways to avoid suffering really nourishes, you know, to that situation that it nourishes, I think is a dehumanizing situation for ourselves ultimately and for other people, that we actually have the antidote to that right in front of us. I was talking to my mother about this today, and she reminded me that compassion is a choice. It's always a choice. It is always amongst the set of options that we have in any situation. It's always amongst the set of options that we have in any interpersonal situation, is to actually hold the suffering of another. We can choose to do it. So compassion must be chosen, right? And then it must be intentional in order to be genuine. I want to wrap up by thinking about some words that I heard, again, thinking about this, this conference that I went to in Modesto. And one of the powerful things that came out of it for me, amongst the many other powerful things I shared a little bit that came out of it, was this understanding of what it will take to stop this situation of dehumanization, right, that we see, which is not new, right? We know it's not new. We found lots of ways to do it, but what's new are sort of the ingenious ways and systems that we've created to continue it and to propagate it. When we don't strive for compassion as our goal, we allow this type of dehumanization, which is kind of a profound crisis in our human life, to take root in ourselves and others. And in a letter that was addressed to the group by Pope Francis, speaking about this, dehumanization, he says that we should neither be paralyzed by fear or shackled within the conflicts of our lives. We have to acknowledge the danger of our current situation, but also the opportunity that any crisis presents. In the Chinese language, one of the words which expresses the understanding of crisis is composed of two ideograms. One called wei, which is somewhere here, which means danger, and the other which is ji, which means opportunity, right? And I think somewhere between those two is our space and our opportunity to be compassionate. I guess I would just sort of wrap up with just a reflection for all of us on what it means to be bold and do this. I'm not saying anything that we don't know. I'm not saying anything that we haven't heard all of our lives in some ways, right? But I just want to offer us all and myself, this thought that every day we do get the opportunity to choose how we're going to engage with other people, with our environment, and even with ourselves, with all of the different parts of ourselves that make up who we are. And I want to offer that the only thing that we know that can't hurt the other is love, right? That's the one thing that we know, right? Now maybe the way we deliver it, maybe the way they receive it, that might be an issue in question. But the one thing we know that can't hurt our neighbor is love. And so I want to offer that to us. Think about the opportunities today that we have to extend that compassion, which is going to take boldness. But I guarantee you that if I do it and you do it, right, and we teach other people to do it, right, through our actions, through our modeling, that eventually it's something that can spread. It can spread in the same way that the systems of dehumanization or the systems that are dehumanizing us can spread. The thing about that is that both are contagious, right? But we get the choice of which contagion we're going to spread, right? The contagion of joy that comes from willingly engaging in other people's struggle or other people's suffering. And I also want us to know it doesn't mean, I don't mean necessarily, just seeking out people in dire, destitute situations. The suffering or the distress that the other can feel, or can be experiencing could be something that I don't see, right? It's important to know, so I don't know. So the big part of compassion that I want to leave us with is that always stepping into the opportunity to hold people in love. It always sounds cheesy. I mean, it sounds like, it sounds cliched. But it's the challenge that, for me, I found is so life-giving. Things start opening up in you, at least in my experience, when I choose to do that. Lessons start to get clearer when I choose to do that, right? You sleep easier at night, and ultimately, that if you've done that, you've awakened something in the other as well. Again, it's infectious, it's contagious. So I invite all of us today to spread that infection, spread that good compassion that compassion brings. Thank you.